Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, everyone else, dogs, cats, living together, total anarchy. Welcome to Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lucht. In this episode, my goodness. This episode we're discussing Springheeled Jack, but some of the lesser known elements and aspects of the story that don't really get enough attention. So I did a little digging. In order to find and bring to you, beautiful people, said lesser known aspects of the Springheeled Jack story, I'm going to try to do it better than anyone else. Kind of like it's a competition. Like I'm bringing that competitive edge to the Springheeled Jack story delivery. So I guess you could say that this is a good old-fashioned Springheeled Jack-off. No, wait! I hadn't said it out loud till that point. Deeply regret it now. Anywho, let's get into the story. In September of 1837, in the village of Barnes, southwest London, a businessman named John Flaxman, which sounds made up, had just finished locking his shop when he heard a scream from the direction of the nearby churchyard. He ran towards the sound and found his 16-year-old daughter Mary collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, her clothing torn, and her face pale with shock. When she could speak, she couldn't at first, but now she can. So when she could speak, she described a figure that had leapt from the shadows, tall and thin, dressed in a long cloak, with eyes that glowed like red coals. Most impossibly, she said, he had breathed blue fire into her face and then leapt away. Not run, not walked, but leapt. Leaped? Leapt? You might hear both from me. I push him back and forth. Clearing the 8-foot wall of the churchyard in a single bound, more powerful than a slinky, subtle as a locomotive. This wasn't the first such report, and it wouldn't be the last. For the next 70 years, and sporadically, for the century and a half after that, the figure known as Springheeled Jack would haunt the British Isles and beyond. He would become a legend, a bogeyman, a conspiracy, and a cultural touchstone. And, depending on which accounts you believe, either a case of mass hysteria, a collective hallucination, or a genuine entity that defies the laws of physics as we understand them. This is the complete history of Springheeled Jack. Not just the familiar Victorian sightings that every paranormal researcher knows, but the American manifestations, the Prague connection, the aristocratic conspiracy that suggests a deliberate campaign of terror conducted by jaded nobility, and the modern sightings that suggest whatever Jack was, he or it may have never left us, and an investigation into the possible secret transmission of a hidden technology that was centuries ahead of its time. The earliest documented sightings that can be definitively linked to the Springheeled Jack legend occurred in October 1837 in the London district of Barnes. The victim was Mary Flaxman, daughter of a local businessman, mentioned above. Her description established the template, a tall, thin figure in a dark cloak with glowing red eyes who breathed fire and possessed superhuman leaping ability. But the legend didn't truly crystallize until 1838. In January of that year, an 18-year-old named Jane Alsop became the most famous victim of the entity. On the night of February 18th, 1838, Alsop heard a knock at the door of her father's house on Bearhind Lane. Yeah, a bit of an ironic name, you'll see in a moment. In the district of Bow, or Bow, B-O-W, not sure. Go with Bow. A man called out, identifying himself as a police officer, and claimed he had captured Springheeled Jack and needed a light. When Jane brought him a candle, she found herself facing a figure who threw off his cloak to reveal what she described in her sworn testimony as, quote, a most hideous and frightful appearance, unquote. The face, she said, was like that of a devil. Pointed ears, protruding nose, and eyes that glowed like great balls of fire. He wore a tight-fitting garment resembling white oilskin. And most terrifyingly, he breathed blue and white flame from his mouth. He seized her and tore at her clothing with metallic claws. She managed to break free and run, but he pursued her to the door of her house, where her sister Elizabeth heard the commotion and came to her aid. At this, the entity simply turned, walked calmly to the end of the lane, and leapt over the 9-foot wall of the local cemetery, disappearing into the night. Jane Alsop's testimony was taken seriously by the authorities. She appeared before the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, and swore to her account. The Lord Mayor issued a public warning about the quote-unquote wretch known as Springheeled Jack, and the newspapers took up the story with sensationalistic fervor. The Times, the Morning Chronicle, and the Penny Dreadfuls all published accounts, and within weeks, Springheeled Jack had become a national bogeyman. But Jane Alsop wasn't the only victim in 1838. 9 days after her attack on February 27th, a young woman named Lucy Scales was walking with her sister near their home in Limehouse when they encountered a figure matching Jack's description standing in the shadows of an alley. The figure breathed directly into Lucy's face, temporarily blinding her and causing her to collapse in seizures. Her sister reported that the entity laughed, a high metallic sound, and then leapt onto the roof of a nearby house, bounding from rooftop to rooftop until he was out of sight. These two incidents, the Alsop attack and the Scales attack, established the pattern that would define the legend. The appearances in residential areas, the use of fire or the appearance of fire breathing, the attacks on young women, the metallic claws, the superhuman leaping ability, and the apparent invulnerability to pursuit. The entity seemed to operate with impunity, appearing and disappearing at will, leaving the authorities baffled and the public terrified. The panic reached such heights that vigilante groups formed in several London neighborhoods. Men armed with clubs and pistols patrolled the streets after dark. The Duke of Wellington, then 70 years old, reportedly armed himself with pistols and patrolled his own grounds in search of the creature. The Lord Mayor offered a reward for information leading to Jack's capture. Nothing worked. The entity continued to appear, attack, and vanish. In April 1838, a peculiar incident occurred in the village of Stockton, in the north of England. A businessman named Captain Finch was walking near the local church when he encountered a figure who leapt over the church wall and landed directly in his path. The figure was described as wearing a bearskin cloak and having glowing red eyes. When Finch raised his walking stick in defense, the entity laughed, grabbed him by the arm, and threw him to the ground with what Finch described as, quote, inhuman strength, unquote. The entity then leaped clear over the church steeple, described as 40 feet high, and vanished. This account, published in the Stockton and Darlington Gazette, is one of the most extreme in terms of the alleged leaping ability, and it established that Jack was not confined to London. By the end of 1838, Springheeled Jack had become a cultural phenomenon. Penny dreadfuls, cheap sensationalist literature, that's what the majority of people consider them. I would kind of think of them as a precursor to comic books, but that just began publishing fictionalized accounts of his exploits. Plays were staged in London theaters, mothers used him to threaten misbehaving children, and yet the attacks continued, blurring the line between folklore and genuine criminal activity. This blurring of folklore and reality is nowhere more evident than in the jarring inconsistencies regarding the entity's appearance. The primary challenge for both Victorian investigators and modern researchers is reconciling the man, devil, and bear trichotomy that emerged from the 1837 to 1838 accounts. If Springheeled Jack was a single flesh-and-blood criminal, he possessed a wardrobe as vast as it was bizarre. If he was a supernatural entity, his shape-shifting knew no bounds. The most grounded explanation is that Jack frequently changed outfits to suit his environment and psychological objectives. In the sophisticated residential districts of Bow, and Limehouse, the aristocratic gentleman's cloak allowed him to move unnoticed among high society, acting as a bit of a Trojan horse before he unveiled the shocking white oilskin devil suit underneath. Conversely, in the rural, darker suburbs of London and northern England, as seen in the early October attacks and Captain Finch encounter in Stockton, a heavy bearskin offered practical advantages. It provided insulation against the bitter cold, offered protection if a victim fought back, and played into primal animalistic fears that a sleek urban costume was unable to evoke. However, the rapid succession of attacks and the geographic spread of the sightings led many to suspect a far more coordinated effort, the existence of multiple Jacks. The concept of a gang of aristocratic pranksters was popular even in 1838. Rumors fiercely targeted Henry de la Poer Beresford, the third Marquis of Waterford. Known as the Mad Marquis, Waterford was an infamous, wealthy miscreant with a history of violent practical jokes, contempt for women, and a massive fortune. It's highly plausible that Waterford, potentially aided by a cabal of bored, wealthy young noblemen, invented the initial Jack persona as a cruel game. Under this theory, different members of the group likely wore different costumes. One might prefer the terrifying realism of a bearskin to stock rural lanes, while another wore the tight oilskin and mechanical spring-loaded boots to terrorize London proper. The high metallic laugh noted by so many victims may not have been the mark of a single monster, but the shared mocking roar of a wealthy elite hiding behind masks. When the press heavily sensationalized the Alsop and Scales cases, copycat criminals across England undoubtedly joined the fray. By late 1838, Springheeled Jack was no longer just a man in a costume or a group of aristocrats playing a deadly game. He'd become an open-source myth. Anyone with a dark cloak, a pair of stilts, a bearskin, or a match could become the bogeyman for a night, ensuring that the creature could simultaneously be a gentleman, a demon, and a beast. The year 1839 saw a shift in the Springheeled Jack phenomena. The attacks became less frequent, but more violent, and a pattern began to emerge that suggested not a supernatural entity, but a deliberate campaign of terror conducted by human agents. On September 10th, 1839, a woman named Jane Shaw was attacked in the village of Brixton. Where were the guns that night, I ask you? Her assailant was described as wearing a horned... That's a Clash reference. Anyone gets it? You're awesome. Anywho, her assailant was described as wearing a horned helmet and a cape of shining material, quote-unquote shining material. He scratched her face with what she believed were iron claws and attempted to drag her into a waiting carriage before she was rescued by passers-by. This was the first report of Jack using a vehicle, suggesting human accomplices. More significantly, 1839 saw the first whispered accusations against specific individuals. The name that emerged was Henry de la Poer Beresford, 3rd Marquis of Waterford. The Marquis was a notorious figure in aristocratic circles, a rake, a drunkard, a man who had once painted the toll gates of a town red as a prank and who was rumored to have forced a parson to dance a jig at gunpoint. He was exactly the type of jaded, wealthy aristocrat who might conceive of Springheeled Jack as a cruel joke. The theory, which has persisted for nearly 2 centuries, runs as follows. The Marquis of Waterford and a group of his equally debauched friends, possibly including the Duke of Marlborough, Joseph of Camellight, and other members of the Mad Marquis set, conceived of Springheeled Jack as a prank to terrorize the lower classes. They constructed spring-loaded devices for their boots, hence the impossible leaps, and used phosphorescent chemicals to create the appearance of fire-breathing. The metallic claws were glove-mounted devices. The entire campaign was an exercise in aristocratic sadism, a way for bored nobles to amuse themselves at the expense of the terrified populace. There is circumstantial evidence for this theory. The Marquis of Waterford was known to be in London during the period of the attacks. He had a history of cruel pranks. He was an expert horseman and athlete, capable of the physical feats attributed to Jack. And most tellingly, after 1840, when the Marquis married and supposedly settled down, the Springheeled Jack attacks diminished quite significantly. But the theory has problems. The leaping ability, described by many accounts, clearing walls of 9, 12, and even 40 feet, exceeds what any mechanical device of the period could achieve. The attacks occurred in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting either multiple jacks or extraordinary mobility. And some of the witnesses described phenomena, the glowing eyes, the ability to appear and disappear, etc., that suggest something beyond human technology. Nevertheless, the aristocratic conspiracy theory gained enough traction that in 1840, a group of citizens in Richmond, southwest London, petitioned the Home Secretary to investigate, quote, certain persons of quality, unquote, suspected of being behind the attacks. The petition was ignored, but it indicates that the theory was a current even at that time. The inverted Batman narrative, as I like to refer to it, emerges clearly here, where Batman is a wealthy man who uses his resources to protect the vulnerable. Springheeled Jack, if the aristocratic theory is correct, is a wealthy man who uses his resources to terrorize the vulnerable. Both operate outside the law, both use gadgets and theatricality, and both create a persona that transcends their ordinary identity. But where Batman's morality is absolute, Jack's is absent. He's the dark mirror, the vigilante as predator rather than protector. The Marquis of Waterford died in 1859, but the Springheeled Jack legend didn't die with him. In fact, the most bizarre and disturbing phase of the phenomenon was yet to come. In 1877, Springheeled Jack returned to public attention in spectacular fashion. This time, the setting was Aldershot, Hampshire, home of the British Army's largest training camp, and this time, the witnesses weren't frightened young women, but armed soldiers. The first incident occurred on the night of August 9, 1877. Private John Reagan of the North Lancashire Regiment was on sentry duty at the North Camp, and he saw a figure approaching in the darkness. The figure was described as wearing a long cloak and a helmet. When Reagan challenged him, the figure slapped him across the face with an icy cold hand that Reagan said felt like, quote, like a hand of metal, unquote. Reagan reported that the figure then laughed, a strange ringing sound, and leaped over his head, clearing him by what Reagan estimated to be 8 feet, and vanished into the night. The incident was reported up the chain of command and caused quite a sensation within the military. Commanding officer, Colonel B. Bond, no relation, ordered an investigation but found nothing. The soldiers, however, were terrified. Sentries began refusing night duty unless accompanied by armed guards. The camp was put on alert. Then, on August 29, 1877, the entity appeared again. This time, multiple soldiers witnessed the event. A figure in a helmet and a cloak approached the perimeter fence, ignored challenges, and simply leaped over the fence, described as 12 feet high, and landed among the sentries. The soldiers opened fire. According to the report filed by Captain B.J. Hawks, Hawktua, the figure laughed, turned, and leaped back over the fence, bounding away at a series of enormous leaps that carried him, quote, clear over the roofs of the married quarters, unquote, and right out of sight. The Aldershot incidents are crucial for several reasons. First, they provide multiple witnesses with military training, suggesting the reliability of their observations. Second, they occurred in a controlled environment with perimeter security, making hoaxing much more difficult. Third, the entity's apparent immunity to gunfire, if the soldier's aim was true, suggests something beyond human capability. The military investigation concluded that the entity was, quote, a person or persons unknown, employing some mechanical contrivance for leaping, unquote. No contrivance was ever found. The incidents ceased after September 1877, but the legend was permanently established in the military consciousness. The Springheeled Jack phenomenon was not confined to Britain. Beginning in the 1930s and continuing sporadically through the 1970s, similar entities were reported in American cities, suggesting either a copycat phenomenon, a cultural migration of the legend, or something genuinely inexplicable that manifests differently across cultures. The first significant American wave occurred in 1938-1939 in the city of Louisville, Kentucky. Beginning in November 1938, residents of the Portland neighborhood reported a leaping man who attacked women, breathed fire, and possessed superhuman agility. The entity was described as wearing a white cloak and having glowing red eyes. On November 12, 1938, a woman named Mary Long was attacked near her home on North 26th Street. She described her assailants as having, quote, spring-loaded shoes, unquote, that allowed him to leap over fences. The Louisville police conducted an investigation and arrested a man named John Thomas. UK listeners are probably having a good chuckle at that one. A local eccentric who had indeed constructed spring-loaded shoes. Thomas was charged with assault, but he was physically unable to match the descriptions of the leaping ability. He could manage only small hops, not the 10-foot clearances reported by witnesses. Moreover, attacks continued while Thomas was in custody. The case was never solved, and the Louisville Springheeled Jack became a local legend. In 1945, during the final months of World War II, a series of attacks occurred in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Military wives reported a figure in a quote-unquote silver suit who could leap extraordinary distances and who appeared near the military installations. The descriptions were similar to the British Jack, tall, thin, glowing eyes, but the silver suit suggested something more technological, possibly connected to the military experimentation occurring in the area. The most significant American manifestation occurred in 1953 in the city of Houston, Texas. Beginning in March of that year, residents of the 5th Ward reported a quote-unquote leaping devil who attacked women and children. The entity was described as black-clad, with red eyes and metallic claws. On March 15, 1953, a teacher named Margaret Jones was attacked in the parking lot of her school. She described the entity as having springs in his heels, quote-unquote, that made a distinct sound when he landed. The Houston police created a special task force to investigate what they termed the Leaper. They consulted with engineers about the feasibility of spring-loaded footwear and concluded that while such devices existed, they couldn't account for the described leaping ability, clearing 15-foot fences in single bounds. The attack ceased in April 1953, and the case remains unsolved. In 1974, a wave of sightings occurred in Memphis, Tennessee. Teenagers reported a quote-unquote Batman figure who could leap between rooftops. The descriptions were inconsistent, suggesting multiple hoaxers or a phenomena that defied consistent perception. Nevertheless, the Memphis Leaper entered local folklore and is still discussed in paranormal circles. The American manifestation suggests that whatever Springheeled Jack represents, whether a psychological archetype, cultural virus, or a genuine entity, it's capable of crossing oceans and adapting to new environments. The American Jacks were more technological, less supernatural, but retained the core elements: the leaping, the attacks on women, the theatricality, and the immunity to capture. One of the most obscure and fascinating connections to the Springheeled Jack legend emerged from the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia during World War II. In Prague, between 1940 and 1945, a figure known as Parak, or the Springer, became a symbol of resistance and a terror to the occupying forces. The name Parak derives from the Czech word for spring or coil, pero, P-E-R-O, and the legend describes a figure who could leap incredible distances, appearing on rooftops to spy on German patrols, and who attacked Nazi soldiers and collaborators. Unlike the British Jack, Parak was portrayed as a hero, a mysterious figure who protected the Czech people from their oppressors. The first documented Parak sighting occurred in 1940, shortly after Nazi occupation began. A German patrol reported being attacked by a figure who leaped from a rooftop, kicked one soldier to the ground, and vanished in a series of bounds that carried him over the city's medieval walls. The Germans dismissed the report as a fantasy, but similar incidents continued throughout the occupation. By 1942, Parak had become a cultural phenomenon. Czech resistance fighters spread stories of the Springer to demoralize the occupiers and inspire the occupied. Posters appeared showing a leaping figure with the slogan, "Parak is watching." The Germans, unable to capture the figure, offered a reward for information leading to his arrest, but no one claimed it. The crucial question is whether Parak was a real person, a collective resistance identity, or something else entirely. Some historians suggest that Parak was a code name used by multiple resistance fighters who employed parkour-like techniques to navigate the city's rooftops. Others suggest that the legend was entirely folkloric, a psychological weapon created by the resistance. But there are disturbing parallels to Springheeled Jack that suggest something stranger. Parak was described as having glowing eyes, attributed by the Germans to quote-unquote reflector technology, but described by Czech witnesses as genuinely luminous. He was said to appear and disappear impossibly quick, to be immune to gunfire, and to laugh, a high strange sound during his attacks. After the liberation of Prague in 1945, Perák sightings ceased. Some resistance fighters claimed to have been Perák, but none could demonstrate the leaping ability described in the legends. The figure passed into Czechoslovakian folklore, subject of a 1946 animated film by Jiří Trnka, the first animated film ever made about a superhero, predating Superman cartoons by several years. The Perák connection suggests that Springheeled Jack represents something that can be invoked by cultural need, a template of sorts that manifests as hero or villain depending on the context. In Victorian Britain, he was a terror. In occupied Prague, he was a protector. The same abilities, the same theatricality, and the same impossibility, but serving opposite moral functions. The Springheeled Jack legend didn't end with the Victorian era. Sightings have continued into the 21st century, suggesting that whatever the entity represents, it remains active in the collective unconscious, or in physical reality. When we map out the modern timeline of this phantom, we can look at three distinct anchor points. It begins in the mid-1980s, with what researchers call the Borderland Slapper incident. It then spikes dramatically in February of 2012 with the Surrey bank climber sighting, before dissolving into late 2010s with a wave of suburban roof runner reports. Each era shows an entity perfectly adapting to its environment. While the famous 1877 military base incidents at Aldershot are well documented, the trail doesn't completely die there. In 1986, a bizarre encounter was reported near the border of Wales. A traveling salesman driving along a dark road reported being accosted by a strange, malevolent creature. The entity behaved erratically, slapping the man before executing an enormous superhuman leap and vanished into the darkness. The salesman specifically noted the creature's unsettling features, including an unnaturally long chin. Where the legend truly migrates into the modern era is the string of unaccountable encounters, recorded since the turn of the millennium. One of the most credible and widely cited modern accounts occurred on a dark night in February of 2012. In the town of Stoneleigh, Surrey. A resident named Scott Martin was riding in a taxi late at night when out of nowhere, a dark, indistinct figure darted across the road directly in front of the vehicle. Instead of running down the street, the entity bounded toward a steep 15-foot roadside bank and scaled it vertically in a matter of seconds, moving with a fluid speed that defied normal human anatomy. Martin later wondered if this was the very same individual who had earned himself the name of Springheeled Jack so many years ago, noting that no ordinary human could jump that high without breaking their ankles. In the years following the encounter, across the late 2010s, the phenomenon shifted into the digital age. Across various suburban developments in the UK, localized internet forums and neighborhood watches began lighting up with reports of what the British press dubs roof runners. While often dismissed by skeptics as mere parkour enthusiasts, several of these anomalous reports mirrored Jack's original Victorian modus operandi. Witnesses describe a completely silent prowler, clad in dark or tight-fitting gear, spotted standing completely motionless on apex roofs before crossing massive architectural gaps between houses without making a single sound. What do these modern incursions tell us? When you look at the trajectory of the phenomena, Springheeled Jack has quietly evolved to survive in the modern landscape. In the Victorian era, he haunted gas-lit London alleys and military camps, defined by fire-breathing, metallic claws, and flowing capes that cemented him as a classic penny dreadful villain or regional boogeyman. But in the 21st century, he shed the theatrical cape for suburban roadsides, rooftops, and dark borders. His traits have shifted to a fluid agility, extreme vertical scaling, and a shadow-like presentation that mirrors modern internet creepypasta and the Slender Man archetype. Whether these modern witnesses are catching a glimpse of a flesh-and-blood anomaly using advanced kinetic technology, or simply projecting a 19th century archetype onto the shapes of 21st century urban panic, the leaping terror refuses to stay anchored to the Victorian past. Beyond the well-documented encounters, there exist fragments of the Springheeled Jack legend that have received little attention. Obscure references, forgotten incidents, and bizarre anomalies that suggest the phenomenon was far stranger than a simple case of mass hysteria or an aristocratic prank. Most standard histories of Springheeled Jack begin in January 1838, when he assumes his famous caped gentlemanly appearance. But the true, terrifying origin of the panic began months earlier in late 1837 in the rural villages south of London, like Barnes and East Sheen. In these earliest rumors, the entity didn't wear a cloak or breathe fire. It was a shapeshifter. Witnesses first reported being attacked by a phantom, quote, white bull, unquote, that charged out of the darkness. Weeks later, the exact same entity was said to have assumed the form of a massive, unearthly white bear, quote unquote, that locals simply referred to as the Evil One. It wasn't until later that the entity consolidated into a humanoid figure wearing brass armor and spring-loaded shoes, leading us to wonder if the original Victorian panic was actually rooted in an old-world predatory creature legend. While many texts briefly list Liverpool as the site of Jack's final historical appearance in 1904, they almost always fail to cover the genuinely bizarre reality of what happened on William Henry Street. The panic wasn't just a few people pointing at the sky. It was a neighborhood-wide meltdown. The 1904 Liverpool outbreak was intrinsically tied to an active, terrifying poltergeist case on nearby Stitt Street, where a boarded-up house was being subjected to a heavy barrage of debris and furniture flying through the air by unseen hands. This sent local crowds into a panic, which culminated in sightings of an agile figure leaping across the Everton rooftops. When the local press finally cornered an explanation years later, the truth was deeply tragic. A local man suffering from severe religious mania would regularly scale the rooftops during his episodes, screaming into the night sky that his wife was the devil, and leaping from house to house to evade the fire ladders and police sent to capture him. The incidents at the Aldershot military camp in 1877 are famous because sentries allegedly fired their rifles at a leaping figure, only for the bullets to have absolutely no effect. But the most disturbing detail of this military wave is rarely highlighted. During his final approach that summer, the entity didn't just bound past the perimeter fence, he actively closed the distance on a guard. According to the original reports, the cloaked phantom stepped into the lantern light, reached out, and violently slapped the sentry across the face with what the traumatized soldier described as a, quote, death-like ice-cold hand, unquote. This wasn't a mechanical trick or a clever prankster in boots. It was an intimately physical, terrifyingly cold intrusion that left the military base completely unnerved. If you examine the court testimonies of Jack's most famous victims, like Jane Alsop and Lucy Scales from 1838, a chilling psychological tactic emerges. Jack didn't hunt from the shadows. He used a mask of polite Victorian normalcy to lower the guards of his victims. In multiple cases, he would approach a home on a dark lane dressed as an immaculate, high society gentleman, sometimes even mimicking a London police officer to politely ask a young woman for a light or a candle. The terrifying pivot happened the exact second the light was provided. He would instantly throw off his outer cloak to reveal a tight-fitting, glistening white oilskin suit and a hideous helmet, his eyes turning into balls of glowing red fire before he vomited chemical blue flames directly into his victims' faces. When we strip away the fictional additions and stick strictly to the historical account, the reality of Springheeled Jack remains completely unsolved. If we look at the pure physical mechanics described by Victorian witnesses, clearing 9 to 12-foot vertical walls from a dead standstill, even modern athletic science acknowledges that this is physically impossible for a human being without mechanical assistance. This leaves us with a haunting historical riddle. Were generations of Victorian citizens, naturalists, and police officers simply blinded by a massive decades-long wave of contagious urban hysteria? Or did a single, highly sophisticated bad actor, or something entirely unclassifiable, possess a technology that's never existed anywhere else in the human record? Long before Springheeled Jack ever scaled his first wall, London was entirely paralyzed by a predator known to history as the London Monster. Between 1788 and 1790, a wave of terror swept through the city, targeting young women walking at night. The monster's modus operandi was uniquely sadistic. He would approach a woman under the guise of an ordinary pedestrian, whisper horrific, lewd obscenities into her face, and then instantly slash or stab her across the thighs and butt with a hidden blade before vanishing into the crowd. The panic reached such a fever pitch that a moral hysteria gripped London. Men began forming vigilante patrols, women wore protective brass plates hidden beneath their petticoats, and prominent citizens offered massive rewards for his capture. The sheer variety of descriptions and weapons led investigators to believe that the monster wasn't a single man, but an infectious psychological pathology that triggered dozens of copycat slashers across the city. When Springheeled Jack emerged decades later, he inherited this exact lineage of urban panic. In fact, if you look very closely at the 1838 testimonies of Jack's victims, his attacks heavily mirrored the older slasher scares. He didn't just scare people by jumping, he actively used claws and hidden weapons to rip the clothing and flesh of the women he trapped. These twin terrors, the leaper and the slasher, represent the dual anxieties of the modern city. While Springheeled Jack represented a fear of the impossible, supernatural predator striking from above, the butt-stabbing panics represented something far more grounded and insidious. The realization that a violent, deeply deviant monster could be hiding right behind you in the everyday crowd, completely indistinguishable from an ordinary gentleman until the blade was already drawn. When we look at the pure mechanics of the Springheeled Jack phenomenon, we're forced to confront a deeply unsettling question. Was the leaping terror a product of psychological contagion, or was it the result of a highly sophisticated, real-world technology that somehow slipped through the cracks of mainstream history? To trace this second possibility, the technology transmission theory, we have to piece together a delicate tapestry of verified historical records, unverified folklore, and speculative connective tissue. If Springheeled Jack was real, he may have begun as an audacious upper-crust social experiment, an early aristocratic psyop of sorts, probing how mass hysteria and sensationalized press rumors could be weaponized against the public. To understand how such a device could even be possible in the early 19th century, we must first recognize that the use of springs in mechanical prosthetics and engineering dates back much further than most people realize. It's a fully verified historical fact that as early as 1508, the famous German mercenary Gotz von Berlichingen lost his right arm to a cannonball and subsequently commissioned a local blacksmith to fashion an intricate iron replacement. This legendary iron hand was intricately articulated by a sophisticated series of internal springs, allowing the commander to grip reins, wield a sword, and write with surprising force. While this was an upper limb rather than a locomotive device, it conclusively proves that spring-articulated prosthetics were well within the technological capabilities of early modern European metalworkers. By the 18th century, this expertise migrated into the realm of high luxury and performance art. It's historically verified that European clockmakers possessing the absolute pinnacle of precision metalwork skills were constructing fully autonomous mechanical figures capable of mimicking human behavior with uncanny accuracy. The famous Jacques Droz's automata, I think that's how you say it, constructed between 1768 and 1774, included a mechanical writer, a draftsman, and a musician. These figures were entirely powered by complex internal spring-driven movements that allowed for lifelike, fluid human motions. What remains deeply speculative, however, is whether this highly advanced clockwork and metallurgical technology was ever actively applied to large-scale human locomotion before the modern era. While the raw materials and engineering intelligence certainly existed, the specific application of these principles to high-velocity jumping apparati has never been definitively documented in surviving industrial blueprints. If we venture into a hypothetical reconstruction of what such a device might look like based entirely on the consistent descriptions of Springheeled Jack's victims, we can extrapolate the exact engineering requirements. To propel a roughly 150-pound human being 9 to 12 feet vertically in the air, a mechanism would need to efficiently store and instantaneously release a massive amount of kinetic energy. In theoretical speculation, this concept heavily mirrors modern Bladerunner running prosthetics, developed by the Icelandic company Össur in the 1990s, which utilized curved carbon fiber springs to store energy during a step's compression phase and snap back during extension. To attempt this same feat in the 1830s, an engineer would have had to rely on heavy laminated steel strips. While historically verified as a mature technology used in carriage suspension, steel springs would have been significantly heavier and far less efficient than modern composites, demanding a pilot of immense physical strength and athletic coordination. This mechanical blueprint sheds a fascinating speculative light on the original eyewitness testimonies. The strange, tight-fitting white oilskin or waterproof garment described by victims like Jane Alsop could easily have been a specialized coverall designed to hide an ugly, complex mechanical frame strapped to the pilot's torso and legs. Furthermore, the terrifying metallic claws that Jack used to tear at his victims' clothing might not have been weapons at all, but rather the exposed, functional steel ends of a spring-loaded foot mechanism designed to grip rooftops, scale brick walls, and absorb the crushing impact of a 20-foot drop. If such an advanced, top-secret technology did exist in the 1830s, how exactly did it travel across borders and decades? In constructing a narrative bridge between these disparate events, a compelling, highly speculative transmission path emerges. We know for a verified fact that the original outbreak of Springheeled Jack sightings in London between 1837 and 1840 perfectly overlapped with the final rowdy years of Henry de la Poer Beresford's wild period. Better known to the tabloids as the Marquis of Waterford, or simply the Mad Marquis, this notorious nobleman was famous for his obscene wealth, practical jokes, and violent drunken vandalism. Crucially, the Marquis maintained a massive state-of-the-art private workshop at his estate in Curramore, Ireland, where he routinely experimented with avant-garde mechanical devices. Victorian tabloids and local police heavily speculated at the time that a titled prankster or a small secretive cadre of aristocratic youngbloods were the true culprits behind the London Panic. Reports of a mysterious accomplice carriage waiting on the dark near attack sites, combined with the selective targeting of vulnerable working-class districts, strongly fed the popular rumor that Jack was an elite thrill-seeker completely untouchable by the law. It's theoretically possible that the Mad Marquis or his wealthy associates commissioned custom-made spring-loaded boots to terrorize the public. This idea gains real traction when you consider the verified fact that spring stilts and specialized jumping boots designed for acrobats and circus entertainers were actively documented and used throughout Europe from at least the 1820s going forward. For a bored, eccentric billionaire of the Victorian era, scaling up circus technology for a terrifying late-night game of urban hide-and-seek was well within the realm of possibility. From this point, the historical timeline begins to branch out into fascinating but unverified folklore and deep geopolitical connections. For example, it's a recorded historical fact that in 1838, the brilliant American engineer Samuel Colt traveled to London to secure international investors for his revolutionary revolving firearms. Through historical conjecture, one can imagine a scenario where Colt, navigating the highest echelons of British industrial society, crossed paths with wealthy inventors connected to the Marquis of Waterford's eccentric circle, potentially catching wind of their experimental locomotion designs. Colt later established his major manufacturing hub in Paterson, New Jersey. While some alternative historians claim that a copycat leaping devil terrorized the factories of Paterson in 1843, this specific American link remains entirely unverified and can't be authenticated in local archives. Similarly, the technology theory frequently leaks into the chaos of the American Civil War. It's well documented that the sheer volume of battlefield amputations between 1861 and 1865 triggered a massive, historically verified boom in prosthetic innovation on both sides of the conflict. However, persistent fringe rumors regarding a hyper-advanced spring-assisted leg prototype allegedly built for Confederate scouts, often referred to in underground lore as Jukes limbs, quote-unquote, Jukes limbs, remain entirely unverified and are largely considered to be modern historical fabrications. The same historical dead ends apply to other popular alternative theories, such as claims that Nikola Tesla patented a mechanical exoskeleton in 1898, that the legendary explorer Richard Francis Burton hid sketches of leaping mechanisms in his private diaries, or that the Czech inventor Josef Ressel left behind secret notebooks detailing spring-powered human locomotion. None of these tantalizing clues can be verified in any official patent office or academic library, however. Yet despite the lack of a physical paper trail, the phantom archetype refused to die. Instead, the mimetic virus mutated and traveled across the European continent, spectacularly re-emerging over a century later in the darkest days of World War II. During the brutal Nazi occupation of Prague, Czech citizens began whispering about a terrifying heroic entity known as Perák, the Spring Man. According to verified folklore studies, Perák was described as a caped, shadowy phantom who possessed the mechanical ability to vault over entire streetcars, rushing rivers, and burning rooftops with little to no effort. He used his superhuman agility to actively sabotage German troop movements, escape the Gestapo, and rescue local civilians from the clutches of the occupying forces. Prague was also the original home of the Golem, so might this be a more mechanical instance of history repeating itself, perhaps? While wartime Nazi propaganda and post-war communist media framed Perák as a literal patriotic resistance fighter, modern folklore analyses present a more grounded reality, interpreting the Spring Man as a highly effective, morale-boosting urban legend born out of total wartime censorship, paralyzing fear, and intense blackout paranoia. Despite the decades separating them, both Springheeled Jack and Perák share an identical, unmistakable blueprint: mechanically augmented leaping, terrifying glowing eyes, and a reliance on technological devilry to sow chaos in the streets. Fuck yeah. Both entities emerged in a claustrophobic social climate characterized by severe government information vacuums and intense class or political friction, where raw rumor was weaponized to fill the void. This striking parallel has led modern occult writers, particularly within the British Fortean and esoteric circles, to propose a highly speculative metaphysical hypothesis: that Perák wasn't a physical person, but an egregore, a powerful collective psychic thought form, or tulpa, born out of intense societal trauma, resurrecting the old Victorian archetype to defend a terrorized population. If we synthesize the technology theory with this psychological framework, a chilling evolutionary trajectory takes shape. What began as an elite 19th century aristocratic social experiment, using theatrical effects and circus springs to test the weaponization of mass hysteria and penny press sensationalism, gradually evolved into a potent mimetic weapon. The archetype mutated across empires and battlefields, transforming from a Victorian dandy who embodied deep structural anxieties about industrial smog, sexual violence, and upper-class impunity into a symbol of asymmetric wartime resistance. From there, it's a remarkably short step to bridge this historical phenomenon directly into the dark realities of Cold War psychological warfare, the rumor craft of projects like MKUltra and the modern digital landscape, where folklore is actively engineered into information age mimetic weapons designed to destabilize public perception. When we map the actual verified reports of Springheeled Jack chronologically, they tend to cluster at roughly 20-year intervals, heavily concentrating around major military installations, heavy industrial hubs, and regions with immediate access to cutting-edge metalworking technology. While mainstream historians correctly note that this clustering likely reflects simple population density and reporting biases, the technological explanation offers a far more haunting alternative. Even the entity's terrifying ability to breathe fire can be explained by a continuous adapting lineage of real-world chemistry. A clever saboteur or prankster could have used crude, volatile phosphorus blends in the 1830s, blinding magnesium powder flashes during the late Victorian 1870s waves, military-grade chemical flares during the 1940s European occupation, and advanced LED or chemical vaping devices in modern encounters. All of these specific technologies are fully verified to have existed in their respective historical eras. Ultimately, the true nature of Springheeled Jack remains a profound historical stalemate. What is fully documented and beyond debate is that the necessary spring-loaded technology, advanced metallurgical expertise, and eccentric, highly motivated aristocrats all existed simultaneously in the 19th century to make a leaping apparatus possible. What remains entirely undocumented, however, is a single surviving physical specimen of the device, or any definitive proof of a secret transmission network passing this technology down through the generations. The technological explanation remains a captivating, theoretically viable framework, but it must stand shoulder to shoulder with its rival theories. But Springheeled Jack was either a brilliant, multi-generational wave of cultural mimicry, an unparalleled masterpiece of contagious human hysteria, or an encounter with a genuine, unclassifiable anomaly that science has yet to comprehend. So just what is Springheeled Jack? The question's been asked for nearly 2 centuries now, and the answer still remains elusive. If he was the Marquis of Waterford and his friends, then he represents the darkest aspect of aristocratic privilege. The wealthy using their resources not to protect, but to terrorize, the inverted Batman, who preys on the vulnerable rather than defending them. The aristocratic theory explains the technology, the mobility, the immunity to prosecution, but it fails to explain the most extreme accounts. The 40-foot leaps, the glowing eyes, or the apparent immunity to gunfire. If he was a mass hallucination, a cultural virus that spread through Victorian society and periodically reinfect later generations, then he represents the power of belief to shape perception. The human mind seeing what it expects to see. The collective unconsciousness projecting its fears onto the shadows. But this fails to explain the physical evidence, the scratched faces, the torn clothing, or the large groups of simultaneous witnesses during certain specific incidents. If he was something else, something that genuinely defies the laws of physics as we understand them, then he represents a challenge to materialistic science, a crack in the consensus reality that suggests the universe is stranger and more flexible than we were taught to believe. The Parak connection, the American manifestations, the modern sightings all suggest that Jack isn't a Victorian ghost, but a perennial phenomenon, a template that can be worn by different forces at different times. Perhaps he's all of these, or none, and none. Perhaps the Marquis of Waterford tapped into something real, used technology to invoke an archetype, to become the mask that was waiting to be worn. Perhaps the aristocratic pranksters became possessed by the very legend they created, the mask consuming the men behind it. Perhaps Springheeled Jack is what happens when the human desire for transcendence, the desire to leap beyond ordinary limits, turns dark, becomes predatory, or uses its power not to rise, but to descend upon the innocent. Whatever he is, Springheeled Jack has outlived his creators, outlived his witnesses, and outlived the Victorian world that created him. He's become a permanent resident of the shadow world that exists at the edge of our vision. The world of things that leap and laugh and breathe fire. The world where the laws of gravity are suggestions rather than rules. He's the nightmare of the industrial age. The fear that technology wouldn't liberate but imprison. That progress wouldn't elevate but deform. That the future wouldn't bring utopia, but something that wore the shape of humanity and moved with inhuman speed and grace. He jumps, he's always jumped. As long as there are walls to clear, shadows to hide in, and the human desire to transcend the ordinary, he'll continue to jump, laughing, glowing, leaping into the darkness, and waiting for the next witness, the next victim, and the next chapter in a story that has no end. That's going to do it for this short episode, I think. We'll see how this cuts down after I edit all the mistakes out. But I do believe this is coming with an accompanying episode. Not anything topically related, but if this ends up cutting it short, I'll put out some extra material this week. Why not? This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. Thank you guys for listening so much. I appreciate all of the likes, the subs, comments. Keep them coming. Fucking love it. My name is Michael Lucht, your host. I fucking love you guys. Love yourselves. Love each other. Take care of each other, because we are all we got. See you next episode as we traverse the depths of deep weirdness to the peaks of high strangeness and the outer limits of the Twilight Zone. Also, sorry about my voice. I lost a tooth. It might sound a little weird. I don't know how long this is going to go on, but thank you guys for powering through it either way. Appreciate it. See you on the next one. Peace out. Beep, 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 beep.